Today's visual novel is I.O., or Input Output. I.O. is a cyberpunk visual novel starring multiple protagonists that centers around a series of bizarre events that start with a lunar eclipse in late April. The primary mystery involves the protagonist of Route A, Hinata's, missing sister Mutsuki, and the popular MMORPG at that time, Babylon. For those who have played the likes of Ever 17 or Steins Gate, you can expect the same kind of complex, if somewhat convoluted sci-fi story from this game as well. Also, while I believe you can tackle the routes somewhat out of order, I highly recommend you proceed to play through the game linearly in a route A, B, C, D, E order, as it just makes things flow better and ultimately make more sense. The strongest aspect of I.O. is most certainly the story, even if it is ultimately very poorly executed. While the first route is rather slow and spends a bit of time setting up the world and whatnot, the preceding routes are paced immensely faster. So unlike most visual novels, it's not as much of a snooze fest and is much more tame with its slice of life to plot ratio. However, there are several other frustrations that hold this game back from being anything but average at best. One is how convoluted and hard to follow the plot gets by the end. So much so that it gives Serial Experiments Lain a run for its money. Now, having a complex and hard to follow plot is fine, because the fun is putting the puzzle together. But unfortunately, unlike the aforementioned Lain, which starts off complex and hard to follow, this starts off simple and kind of anime-ish, so it really doesn't give you the vibe that it's something that's going to use up a lot of brain power. Which is why I think I ended up not really caring anymore by the end to even figure out anything for myself. But perhaps the weak characters and poorly executed drama are more to blame for that. I mean, I might have complained about Chaos Head last time about similar things, but at least it was a relatively easy to follow story the whole way through. Backing up to talk about the drama for a second, it is executed pathetically. There's generally little build-up to anything dramatic, and somehow this game makes nothing seem cool, even when it should be. Too many fight scenes with bald guys, I guess. Man, they are so lame. But to give I.O. a break there, even though the fight scenes are lame, I think the fight scenes in every visual novel are lame for the most part, because it's just static sprites doing crazy fireworks stuff with text dialogue. To me, fights are much better in video games and anime, not in books or visual novels. And even when something is supposedly sad happens, it manages to pick all the wrong characters for it to happen to. I'll explain this more in the spoiler section, but all I can say is that the whole game fell completely flat and made some of the most bizarre decisions I've seen in a while. As for the characters, much like Chaos Head, they are all pretty flat and forgettable. I'll give credit to Hinata, Sakuya, and Yayoi in the first chapter though, because all of them seemed alright and well-rounded. However, the rest of the game basically ignores any development any of them got in that chapter, so it's really hard to give the game that much credit. This is because after looking things up, I realized that every route was written by a different author, which is of course about the dumbest thing you can do for a story-based visual novel, as it only results in sloppy messes. It's fine for Karagaze, but for scenario games, please keep it all to one writer. It's clear as day the only one who cared about setting up the characters properly was the first writer, while the rest only cared about getting the plot over with as quickly as possible, or as convolutedly as possible. Basically, the gist about the characters is there's hardly any development and hardly any characterization to any of them. Now thankfully, the music in this game is just so friggin' sweet. It's mostly ambient techno tracks and creepy stuff, but it's incredibly satisfying. So much so that this is one of the only visual novel soundtracks, the others being Rewrite and Umineko, that I frequently go back to and listen to the tunes for. It definitely helped me get immersed into the MMORPG world when Hinata and Sakuya were exploring in the first chapter in particular. So yeah, suffice to say, even if you don't end up checking out this game, I would listen to the soundtrack as the opening song and the ending song are great as well. The art is a bit strange on the other hand, not sure I quite like it, but I give it points for at least being a tad different than most visual novel art. Actually, the thing is, the CG looks fine for the most part, but the sprites look weird, I guess. This actually does happen with certain visual novels from time to time. Sometimes the sprites look great, sometimes the CG looks like crap. Sometimes the CG looks great, sometimes the sprites look like crap. It does happen. The voice acting is actually kind of bland here. Maybe it's because none of the main characters are voiced particularly well, especially Ishtar, who really should have been played by Sakia Seiyu. Most of you would know her as Yumiko from Grisaya, but honestly, it kinda hurt this game for me. It just sounded like no one really was into their roles or really caring about acting very well. Who knows, maybe they were rushed, as this game really does feel that way anyway. In the end, it's just not something I can recommend because it simply falls flat in too many areas. Really, if you want a fun sci-fi experience, you're better off with the likes of Steins Gate. Otherwise, this one's definitely only for the hardcore crowd. Now it's time for some spoiler territory talk. No overview of the game, just some thoughts about each route. Route A was a good time if you ask me. Granted, I would imagine most people would hate Hinata and Sakia in particular, but I liked them because Hinata seemed flawed, much like Takemi was in Chaos Head, but unlike him, he was proactive and also quite intelligent. Also, he would improve during the route. He wouldn't just stay a lethargic, uncaring guy, and he would become a more positive person. Even if, unfortunately, the rest of the writers didn't seem to pay attention to that fact. Sakia is the whiny and annoying childhood friend, so how could I possibly like her? Well, I think one of the things is that the very fact that she acknowledges that she's selfish and whiny, and she's also quite proactive in helping and improving the main character. I won't lie, I became a bit of a shipper in the scene where they hugged when Hinata was getting better in this route. It was easily my favorite scene in the entire game, in fact, because it had a good build-up to it. Character development and build-up and payoff all in the first 6 hours of a visual novel. Am I living in a dream world? Nothing ever happens in the first 6 hours of a visual novel. Anyway, fun times, and really I don't have many issues with it. Route B, on the other hand, is a sloppy mess. Not only does it introduce way too many characters as a group all at once, I know the sisters were in Route A, but they barely were in it at all anyway, and this is the route where it actually gives them some screen time, along with way too many other characters, but it also fails to give any focus to any of them. All it really does is introduce you to them, and then by the end of the route, almost all of them die except one, while the other lives in AI land now or something, I forget, it's weird. They didn't even try to make Mayumi's sister, and yes, I did forget her name. They didn't try to make her remotely likable or sympathizable, unlike Sakia, as she spends most of the time being useless and bitchy. One laughable scene is when the sister confesses to the guy, and yes, I did forget both their names because that's how much of a characters they were. Not anything. They were not very good characters. And for some reason, they thought they should include this even though it did nothing for either character. There wasn't even any build-up to it. It just kinda happened. Then they both died anyway. And I didn't care. Making a group of characters likable enough so a person can feel affected by their death takes a lot of work, by the way. It takes good chemistry, and you have to make sure that they all add something to the group and not just a few characters carrying the entire group. Honey and Clover is the best example of this I can think of. With this, I just felt like it was a bunch of one-note strangers. Rare do I say this, but this author really needed to slow down with this route, as it was over far too quickly to accomplish anything. Or perhaps he just needed to use his time more wisely, but who knows. Route C and D I'm just putting together because both just felt like events were rushing by at the speed of light. Yeah, see, this is where having multiple writers really shows, because clearly they all handle pacing differently. If the game had started out with really fast pacing, then this wouldn't have been so jarring. Honestly, this is just plot dumps to reveals that I didn't give half a crap about, and both writers completely have no idea how to write compelling characters at all. Route E is like, well, it's like that one scene with the architect in The Matrix, if you remember that. I had no idea what the hell it was talking about half the time, nor did I care. Yes, I know I'm repeating that a lot, but it's true. Somehow making all the characters' paths cross, which normally should be awesome, is made as boring and tedious as possible. All to save a character we have never once interacted with. You know, those saving the princess stories don't really work unless they are short or if the princess is saved early enough to establish her as a character. Also, I wanted to kill the writer in this chapter for making it seem like Hinata got zero character development. For some reason, even though his childhood friend is missing, all he can think about is rescuing his sister, whom he doesn't even get along with very well when he does save her. Why? Oh yeah, and Route A' or B', I can't even remember which one because both were crap. he suddenly goes, "Oh yeah, I have a childhood friend that's been missing. I should go save her." And then he does, almost instantly. And then they hook up in about the most unsatisfying way I've ever seen since, like... But you know what the game writers thinks we do care about? Lim. Yeah, Lim. The stupid AI fairy almost dies, and it tries to make it a tragic death scene for some reason. And for some reason, they decide to bring her back at the end, despite allowing all the other characters that were dead to stay dead. The author really thought we cared about Lim that much, and that she was that important to the other characters. Why is she so important to the other characters? I have no clue. No clue. Because she's a quirky fairy. Apparently that's enough work. Oh, by the way, Route E is the climax of the game. Then the game has the gall to really think you're gonna care about what happens after it and play its 5 boring epilogue kind of plot explaining routes. I have not read a visual novel more poorly executed and structured since White Album 2. However, it did do one thing good, same thing White Album 2 did good, and that's it had a solid beginning to make you care and get invested into the rest of the story, even though by the end of both, I didn't care about either. And how many visual novels can I think of with actual strong beginnings? Probably like 5 or so. So at least it did something right. But otherwise, it's really just boring snoring.